All right, today is December 15, 2017. This is the meeting of the CSI implementation group for Kubernetes. Today we are going to do planning for Q1 of next year. Basically figure out whether we want to go to beta or not. Before we do that, let's just do a quick status update and I'll let folks share anything that they want to. So on the agenda, status update. So Luis, do you want to give an update on E2E and docs?
Brad can go first. He's first there. So.
Sure.
No, mine's not so statusy. So you can give yours. Let's talk about this after status stuff.
Okay. E2E is past all. It's waiting to get submitted, I guess.
Okay. Waiting merge.
Yeah. I haven't got an LGTM yet,
Okay.
but I didn't seem like Michelle found anything, any errors.
Okay.
And then docs, I added a ton of documentation today. And the last one I'm working on is how to test your driver, which shouldn't take me too long.
Okay.
But please take a look. What I try to do is I don't try to have all the information there, but more of a summary, and then I refer the reader to where the reference is, right?
Yep. So. Okay. So next thing I want to do is go through the list of to-dos that we had from last time and make sure we're making progress on those. To-do, sort out Kubernetes ownership repo. I followed up on this. The advice I've been given is go talk to the architecture SIG. And then they'll tell us where to put it. And then there's, I think, Caleb who can actually do the moving for us. So I will follow up on that. Jan is going to be out. Today is his last day. Nothing changed there. Okay, I think that was all the outstanding items from last time. Okay, Brad, do you want to talk about the CSI library?
Sure. First, so I'm probably going to be out starting next week as well. I haven't officially put it on the calendar, but it's getting close to time.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so at KubeCon last week, I talked to Clint and some of the other guys from EMC about Go CSI. And I know there's some stuff that we've used out of it, specifically like the mock driver and some other bits. And it's been my feeling that, it's kind of a waste. They have tons and tons of code that they're trying to donate. It's not getting anywhere with us for whatever reason. And it just seems kind of like a waste, right? I mean, we're re-implementing some of the stuff and we kind of have to do it completely separate from what they've already done because they've pretty much already done it. So my conversation to Clint was that, it may be more palatable to the community and to us if it was broken into smaller pieces.
Yeah.
He had to go through and get approval to do that, and he got the approval, and he said if we come back to them and if we want to hack out just the mock driver or just this one particular piece of it, or if we want to chop it up some other way, that they're okay with that and they would not be against it.
Yeah. I have very strong opinions with this library, and I prefer not to use anything from Go CSI unless they are part of the community.
Louis, I don't understand. Unless they're part of what community we're talking about.
Not EMC. So if they take all their code and they move it to that they do not own the code anymore, then I am all for it. But as they still own the repo and they still own the merges, and they still own there's a CLA on that, I don't want to touch that code.
Hey, I got a chance to talk to Clint this week again. So I played with the Go CSI library. Today it does it actually kind of spits out a interface layout for your writing your driver. That's one thing. It's a small shell script. The second thing it does is it handles signals. So I think it's another small block of code. So the third thing is it can do a better logging. So I added some logging code already in there with the interceptors and everything, right? So the three main pieces which GoSI has today, and I want to understand from Clint, like what are the extra other functionalities which is going to have going forward. So I didn't get a clear answer right now. But Vlad, do you know like what are all the other extra features we have?
See, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. The extra features are centered around mostly what we would call basically the spec rules that are baked in the spec that right now we're not necessarily with the first iteration of what we're doing right now, we're not necessarily abiding by all of them. So I know that.
Is it already there, something, or is it like Andrew is working on it? Because I think
all that stuff is already baked in and it's already there.
So today, if I write a, sorry, go ahead. Today, if I write
what I was going to point out is, a simple example. Like for instance, we talked about, and I think I've already mentioned it before, but a simple example is one of the calls to do probe, for instance, is already, it's part of the spec. So what Andrew's done is basically create using the gRPC methodology of interceptors to bake in a lot of these specs rules, so that if you pick up the library, you don't have to necessarily, as an implementer of a driver, you don't have to necessarily worry about that because that's already taken care of for you. So those are the things. Those are the main things, really. Like you mentioned, logging, mocking, and like I mentioned, if you're building drivers, especially if you're building drivers, a lot of the spec rules are baked in for you.
So let me.
Going back to what you were saying, Louis. You're saying that because it's EMC, even though it's open source, that's the problem?
Yes.
Why is that?
It's open source, but it's not open community.
Yeah, so I share in Luis's sentiment here is like I don't want the code to all live in a repository that EMC exclusively owns. And I kind of got the thumbs up from Clint to move some of that code by piece over to a shared library. So we would essentially, like the community that we have now, we would just go and find what we found useful in CSI and start moving pieces over. And
so one concern, like Brad, actually I echo your opinion. One concern which I had was the way I got it was like it'll end up being like people can write the drivers, but then there are extra value add which the Rex will provide on top of it. And most of this is going through that route. If that is the plan, then I say that personally, like for our driver, we haven't made any decision yet, but that will be a bigger concern for people. Yeah. We don't want people to write the drivers and Rex provides the extra value add. I'm not sure how many vendors are going to be okay with that.
Let me just add an opinion.
Just to be clear, I don't think it's value add. I think it's just the implementation is just. I think because Andrew started probably one of the very first implementation of on that side of a provider as far as storage provider. I think a lot of the specs is pretty well captured. I don't think it's anything additional. It's just that things that you would actually need to capture what's actually in the specs is already there. So it's not value add. It's not anything additional. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, let me just add a comment, kind of going back to the beginning of this conversation. To me, as both, a tester writer, a driver writer, a mock writer, all this experience I've had through this project, I have had no need for the Go CSI code, except I find the tool, the CSC tool, extremely nice. So all I do is do the go get for the CSC tool, and then I can test my driver. But the CSI mock driver, I found that I needed it until I actually needed mounting. That's why they use host path. As a driver writer, I used just normal gRPC calls to call my driver. So to me, it wasn't. I mean, I'm talking personal experience, not pushing this on anyone. That I didn't find it as necessary. And so I just want to make sure that before we start going through and talking and saying, look, guys, everybody can use this library, I'm one that really never found the need for it. So just give me my opinion on that. This is just an opinion.
No, and I think it's a valid opinion, because different people will have different experience implementing CSI, because it's gRPC. It is an API, and it is open. It's an open API, and it is meant for your experience to be different. So but I think I just wanted to point out that it doesn't add anything extra.
Yeah,
it just has what's already baked in the spec itself.
Yeah.
So, and Brad, I also wanted to point out, I wasn't part of that conversation with you and Clint, so there might be new developments that I'm not aware of. So I just wanted to throw that out as well.
Yeah, I talked to Clint. He was going to go talk to his director about it, because they, initially he didn't want to break it apart at all. And I said, look, there's no way it's going to even stand a chance unless we break it into pieces. I said there's pieces that the community may be interested in, and there's pieces they consider bloat, quite frankly. But unless we break it into pieces, it's not going to even have a chance to make it. So he went and talked to his director, and they said they were okay with breaking it into pieces, and that we could pull out pieces that we found helpful and try to build a driver layer off of that.
I mean, how do you say legally? We can just grab the code. It's
right.
Apache 2. I mean, we're just trying to be nice and asking.
Right,
So,
it's a courtesy thing, right? And that was kind of my point in reaching out with him. It's like them going and no offense, Vlad, but like EMC going and writing this in a vacuum by themselves isn't a community, isn't a good community angle. And us going and writing this in a vacuum by ourselves isn't a good community angle either, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, I on that I will push back, because I think the vacuum here is the fact that was done throughout the CSI development, and it was open, right? But not during the development cycle of.
I didn't get an invitation to enter CSI Go development community. I mean, I don't know who did.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I mean, I didn't get an invitation to go work, help on this CSI Go library, and I don't know who else did these, outside of EMC. So to me, it's a closed ecosystem, right? And development.
So to be clear, the CSI spec itself was open development. Nobody got an invitation to it. It was
right.
Community, and anybody who wanted to show up.
Right, I'm talking about the library, the Go CSI library.
Oh, okay.
Right? I think that's why we had such a bad reaction to it. It was developed in its own community that none of us were invited to be part of, right? And now we're about to do the same thing and go and rewrite a Go CSI library in our own community. And, it's a little bit more open admission, but it's still.
So from what I hear from Brad, and actually I can echo my opinion too, right? And also from Vlad's opinion, right? So we are open to it, just that, okay, whatever we have today, we can take a relook at it, but we should be able to pick bits and pieces and be able to take it into the driver writers, right? Because Luis is working on drivers, I'm working, RootFS is working, and there are a bunch of folks, and we all want to make sure that what are the drivers we are going to write. If you ask me, I'm open to pick, but I'm open to pick only piecemeal, so that I'm not bought into the entire ecosystem then forcing me to say that I need to write my drivers suited into another environment. That's not going to happen.
Right.
So we all want to have some common library And obviously, like, there are some nice pieces about Go CSI from what I hear from Vlad. We would like them. But what is the best way to get them is the only question. So who would like to take up that work item and get back an answer for that?
Wait, that's a good question, Chakri. I don't want to ignore it, but I just want to add, I don't think it even matters what we pick.
Mhm.
I mean,
I agree.
Driver developers can do whatever they want. If we say, look, here's a library, Go CSI, and if they feel like it's a good idea, then let them take care of it, right? We shouldn't, as the team, us here, we shouldn't decide if Go CSI is good or we pull it. It doesn't matter. That's the whole point of CSI, right? Just say, look.
Actually, you are absolutely right. The only thing is, like, I'm only concerned about what we want to use it for, the Kubernetes CSI common driver, something like Iscuzzy, NFS, right? And
I'm just saying, then
other than that,
sample drivers, don't use it in the sample drivers. Just keep the sample drivers as you have it today. Like right now, everything that you have in the sample drivers is just good enough for somebody to start, right?
They won't be, like, that's one concern, is they won't be sample forever, right? Let's say that if Kubernetes by default wants to include some drivers like NFS and Iscuzzy, because if I want to use a simple NFS server from Linux, no vendor supports it. And there has to be an NSS plugin which has been tested. Let's say that I use it, I test it, and Red Hat has a bigger testing team which will test it too. So, and if you find any issues, extensions, everything will be done to the driver, so that these are like a generic drivers anybody can use. People can override them with their own drivers, but people still want it, something to come with the platform. Think of it as a distro, right? OpenShift will package this.
I'm thinking that the Kubernetes CSI drivers repo is for samples. But that driver you're talking about, like NFS, like real production driver, should go in its own repo with its own people looking over it and testing it and all that stuff.
So that's what Brad has the plans, right? We wanted to move everything to the CSI volumes, right?
Yeah, and I'm saying that driver should have been on the CSI. I mean, sorry, a CI is very strong, reviews and everything, and then those people can decide if they want to use Go CSI. Let them. That's what I said. Right?
Okay, that people is nothing but us, right? I think that's you, me,
RootFS,
Brad.
I mean, right now it's us, but given if what's in tree is any indication of what's to come, it'll be more. So I mean,
No, all I'm saying is, let's say if it is a demonted driver, I will support it. But if it's an NFS driver, I think we as a team kind of own it, right? So I think most of it, actually, I would say that Brad owns it more than anybody, because actually they have been doing the heavy lifting, right? Brad and RootFS have been doing the heavy lifting on the Iscuzzy and NFS side.
So let them pick whatever they want. If they want to, you choose it. If they want to write their own, whatever, right? That's how I feel, because me as a driver writer, I don't need it, right?
So fair. I mean, you're right. Anybody can use whatever driver they want. They can create their own driver. But we have an option here to potentially, share work and minimize some of the effort, and actually form a community the proper way, instead of excluding one person because they didn't create a community behind it. And why I think this is important is what we do inevitably will be copied and pasted for the code base of whatever driver other people do as well. So, if the plugins that Waman writes will be the examples that people use for the base of other plugins. So whether we like it or not, we are somewhat the leaders, in driver development, and people will follow what we do just because our code is the first one out there and it's the first example they see. So we can say, it's just the Wild West, go do whatever you want, or we can try to organize a little bit behind it, or we can just see what shakes out. From the Red Hat side of it, we could just go use the CSI Go library and cruise along like that. We don't like that particularly well because, it's just them owning it, and we would have to go up against whatever process they have and, be fine with whatever CI they have set up or whatever tests, or, and that's not always good.
I mean, I I really appreciate this discussion because it gives us a chance to figure out what we want to do about this. But at the same time, I wanted to Saad, because I have a hard stop at whenever this meeting ends, so I want to make sure that we get.
Yeah, we ran pretty long on this.
Hey, I have actually one quick point. Actually, the bigger decision point for this is actually what Saad is waiting on the architecture team. What is the direction of Kubernetes, right? Once that is clear, I think we already kind of wanted to break it out, as Brad said. That Brad wants to move most of the stuff to the CSI volumes and open up to the community, right? So maybe we'll move most of the drivers from here to the CSI volumes. So that means the drivers will be shift deleted from here and suddenly reappear in CSI volumes, or there might be some other intermediary which we need to come up with. But that's all depending on Saad's getting answer from the architecture team. After that, we'll make the decisions.
Okay,
right?
that sounds good. Let's figure out where these components are going to land, and then we can go from there.
Yep.
Okay. And just so you guys know, like I haven't, gone over to any dark side if there is one, right? Like I just want the community to make as much progress forward as possible, and nobody have like single authority or single ownership of any particular thing.
No, that makes sense. I liked your point of that regardless of what we do here today is going to end up setting an example for folks down the line, and we should make sure we do things consciously rather than just let it happen and regret what happens. Okay, so all good points. We'll revisit it after we figure out what's going on next. Next, I wanted to do planning for Q1. So we need to decide which of the items that are on our long list of items we want to tackle for beta, and whether that's sufficient to declare beta. So from the list that we started last time, I just pasted it up here. Here's what we have. Let's go through them real quick, and then we can decide whether we want them in beta or not. CSI drivers should not depend on Kubernetes. It appears that some of the drivers currently import Kubernetes dependencies. Do we want this for beta or not? If anybody doesn't want it in beta, raise your hand or speak up.
I would rather not.
Block beta on it?
Yep.
Okay, I think I agree because it's completely out of tree, and that shouldn't really be a...
Yeah, we're setting a precedence right now that we don't want going forward.
So do you want to put it a P1, P2, or?
Yeah, we can do P1, P2, but for I'm just crossing it out of beta as this is not even, it shouldn't be a blocker for Kubernetes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I wanted to make sure I understand what we do. Okay, so this is not a blocker to move forward.
Right. We still want to do it, but it shouldn't be a blocker for Kubernetes going to beta.
Wait, whoa. I'm saying something different. I think that we should block on that. I don't think we want to set an example of kube dependencies in the drivers for our beta release.
Yeah, because more people start to use it, then
yes,
that's fine.
I think it's important, but the reason I say it's not critical is because it's completely out of tree. And like Kubernetes code itself does not, the Kubernetes code that delivers CSI doesn't really care about this. It's not locked on it at all. So while I agree it's very important and we should do it and we should do it soon, I don't think whether we move Kubernetes implementation forward to beta or not should be blocked on this, if that makes sense.
Now, the other thing too is,
let's do this. Items required for KDS beta, and we can say external items for
perfect.
Q1. And that way we can track these as things that we want to work on, but not necessarily block the Kubernetes beta on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So unit testing framework, is this in tree or out of tree?
That is out of tree, and that is the sanity work.
Yeah, all the fast tills, next 6 items are all out of tree. We can just move it as a block.
All of these. Okay, so then let's
except for E2E test.
Let's go through.
Oh yeah, E2E test.
But that's E2E test for drivers.
Drivers.
Yeah,
not the K test.
In Kubernetes.
We'll have to be careful there because essentially what that means is we're using the Kubernetes code to test external components, which gets maybe a little funky.
But that's actually what's done today with Gluster and Ceph.
Yeah, but we do those because that code is currently checked in tree. So now that we have an opportunity to decouple ourselves, and having the test be entry is a little funky.
So that's a good point, because I was running the code. I was trying to think. Right now, I'm using a host path driver, but it doesn't really qualify everything that's up because it's on a single
So
node.
I think what we will want to do is like have a handful of different types of plugins that can exercise different paths, but it should not become like the exhaustive list of all drivers that exist kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have on here CSI credentials. The CSI API defined a way to be able to set credentials on create volume, publish, both node and controller. The way that was defined was a little bit funky. We decided not to pick it up for alpha. So I think we should clarify that for beta. So I'd mark this as a P1. Any disagreement?
No.
Okay. Second is, next up is bypassing attach for CSI drivers that don't support attach. So the way that it's currently implemented, all CSI drivers, whether they implement attach or not, need to deploy an external attacher, and the external attacher essentially probes and then does a no op if it doesn't need to do an attach. That's unnecessary. If we can, we should get rid of this to optimize that code path and basically not even create a volume attachment object for drivers that don't support attachment. The tricky part of this is that we have no way of discovering the capabilities on the controller side of a particular driver before we call into it, because the controller never actually calls into the driver. It just creates objects that the drivers respond to. So we may end up that this is kind of a requirement, but let's think through how we can possibly get rid of this requirement.
Didn't you open a PR at CSI for this?
Yeah, so there is actually a related issue here. I'll move it up here because they're related. Allow volume drivers to not implement the controller if not necessary. So these are actually two separate items. One is for having Kubernetes bypass the attach step altogether. The second is when you implement the driver itself, it should not require having to implement the controller. Today, if you had talked to Chakri, you'll notice that all volume drivers have to implement a dummy controller because even if they don't implement provision or create volume or controller publish, they still need to have a controller service. So that was, and this is mostly for external, this is for internal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Next up is having CSI require fully qualified names. We already got this done this quarter, so we can cross that off the list. Registration of sockets with kubelet device plugin mechanism. So this is making sure that the way that we figure out what socket kubelet talks to is something that we generically support across Kubernetes. I know the device plugin stuff has a mechanism that they defined. We weren't sure whether we wanted to use it. I think it's important that we align with that now, because that's setting the precedence for how kubelet will interact with external plugins in general. So it's important that we pick that mechanism up. Be able to handle ephemeral volumes. So this is, today a lot of folks are asking about how they can have something equivalent of like an empty dir that's pre-populated with some data. This is especially important for security folks who want to have some mechanism to be able to inject identity-related, cert-related information for specific reasons. So just thinking about that ephemeral volume use case, I think, is important.
Just a quick time check. I think, Vlad, you said what?
Vlad, yeah, you're over time.
It was,
Sorry,
are we
what's that?
30 minutes or an hour?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I missed it.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, my call is at 2 or in 30 minutes, but
Okay.
I thought maybe we're an hour.
Okay,
We're
cool.
30 minutes. Okay.
So being able to handle ephemeral volumes, I'm going to call it a P1. Do you guys agree or disagree, or do you think this should be P2?
I think that one needs to be discussed on what the requirements are.
Yeah. I think
That
part of the task is figuring out what the requirements are.
Yeah.
This was
I don't
more what
I don't
done
believe you have to
past.
stop beta for that one.
What's that?
I don't think you should stop beta for that.
Yeah. The only thing I'm concerned about is if there's any major changes that we need to make, I would like them to be discovered early. So how about we say understand design for?
Yeah, that's fine. It's just like it's like a nice feature,
Yeah.
but that's
We just need to make sure we're not painting ourselves into a corner and eliminating this huge category of volume plugins.
sure. Is that done today?
In-tree volume plugins do it. So yeah.
Okay.
Next up is the device mount call. Kubernetes has the create volume, attach, and then on the mount side, there's two sets of calls. For those of you who dig around in there, Vlad, you're probably super familiar with this now. There's the device mount call, and then there's the regular mount, which we call the setup at call. The difference between
it's actually mount device. Yeah, that's fine.
Mount device. Oh, so
Yeah.
you're right. You're right.
Mounter.
And the difference is that mount device is called once per volume per node, and the setup at call is called once per pod. And Kubernetes does reference counting and keeping track of how often, how many volumes are referencing a specific, how many pods are referencing a specific volume on a node. So it keeps track of how often to call each of these. Today, CSI doesn't have an equivalent of a mount device call. So for driver plugins that have a device that needs to be mounted and unmounted, and then bind mounts from that device, they have to do reference counting inside the volume plugin, which becomes quite a hassle. And then you have plugins like Iscuzzy, which have the equivalent of an attach that must be done from a local node. And it would be nice to be able to handle those have the complexity on the CO side, so that the driver plugins could be simpler. We're pushing this on the CSI side of things. If it gets approved on the CSI side, then we'll have to make the changes in-tree to support it. I'm going to mark that as a P1 as well. But
I would make that P0.
Make it a P0. I would love to make it a P0. I keep getting pushback from people saying it's not critical, which is true.
Sounds like to me it's critical, but I think you're saying that it also depends on CSI spec. So you want to add that to that.
Oh, okay. So that's a good
dependency.
P0 would be if CSI implements it.
That's right.
So if CSI doesn't implement it, then it would be up to the CO or the driver implementer to figure all this out.
Yeah, they have to do reference counting or whatever they need to do inside the mount call, which is really ugly.
Yeah.
Right.
Next up is moving mount propagation to beta. I think this is a P0 since our feature depends on mount propagation. If that feature is not beta, then that's a no-go. So we need to make sure these move in lockstep.
So I want to add one point over there. Today for mount propagation, you always need privileged. And privileged is an configurable option in Kubernetes.
Sorry, always need what?
Always needs to be privileged. Like you should be able to run with a privileged containers. Kubernetes needs the allow privileged option. So now, given that the base of it, which is a CSI, is going to depend on this, so do we want to remove that option and make it the default?
Make privilege the default?
Yes. Allow privilege the default. If not, nothing will run.
So are you saying that if mount propagation is shared, then by default it also sets the container to privileged?
No, you need, for mount propagation to work, you need a privileged container.
Right.
And privileged container is a configurable option when you're doing a Kubernetes setup.
Yeah.
Today it's not the default, so we should at least make it default. And if you disable it, nothing will work, right? Because the storage subsystem kind of depends on it.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the security guys will be too happy with that.
I think the security guys need to understand that all storage from now on will be privileged. And I think that, following what Shaku's saying, maybe we have like a dash CSI true, and that turns on everything that's needed for a CSI driver. You see what I mean? One of them being.
We're not going to be able to push CSI specific flags into Kubernetes.
But I'm just saying that.
It
Look,
would be
this is
nice.
the future. This is the future.
So actually, this actually we should talk to more folks, because I agree with you. People won't like LO privileged, but then our storage system is completely going to be dependent on it. So what is the answer for that then?
Yeah.
Because if I go to a customer who doesn't want to run LO privilege, then suddenly none of the CSI drivers will work for him.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a task to take on. We can probably make that
Open issue for it.
Split
Okay.
up with that. So if you're saying that we have to run Kubernetes in privileged mode to use the CSI drivers.
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the point here is like we don't need all of the privileged mode to run CSI. We really just need like the mount propagation, which requires privileged mode.
So there's three moving bits here. One is mount propagation, which we have in alpha. We're going to move to beta. Second is whether the container is privileged or not, and you can control that via pod security policy. And the third bit is whether you're even allowed to run privileged containers inside a given cluster, which is controlled by this allow privilege flag that's passed into Kubernetes. And so by default, that flag today is set to false. And that means that even if you have a standard Kubernetes cluster, by default, you have to like redeploy Kubernetes to set this to true to allow you to set your containers to privileged. So I think Chakri's argument is we should change that default so that default cluster deployments aren't screwed by default.
Right.
So on the GKE side of things, for example, we do set allow privilege enabled by default, or we override the default to set it to true. So if Kubernetes wants to set it true by default, like we wouldn't have any concerns with it, but I'm not sure if that's true across the board because it's taking something where we were more secure by default and making it less secure by default, which usually.
Well, right. And what I was going to say is like we don't want the entire cluster to run in privileged mode just for CSI.
Yeah.
Right. Is there some way to make it so the cluster is not in privileged mode, but we'd still run the CSI okay?
Not really. For a driver, you need to run it on every node. So every node must have capability to run privileged pods.
That's correct. Because the kubelet needs to communicate to the mount. Yeah. Every node must have it.
So Jan, actually, I was thinking about it. The capsys admin is not enough.
Capsys admin just means you're privileged to do whatever you want, pretty much. So
Yeah, but I thought that capsys admin was not enough, because when I tried it, I landed into some other issues. But I saw Ant's documentation; it requires privileged. Is there something like I did wrong, or if you just provide capsys admin, that's not enough?
The reason that privileged mode is needed is that it's very obvious that if you allow users to run privileged pods, then they can mess up the system. So it's visible.
But if I just run CSI driver as capsys admin, won't I be able to use the mount propagation by default?
If we change kubelet, then yes.
No, if I don't change kubelet, but I run a pod with a capability like a capsys admin, I'm not running it as a complete privileged.
I don't think so. I think it's checked somewhere in the code. I don't remember where, but I think there is a check that shared propagation can be enabled only on privileged pods. It can be changed quite easily. It's not a big deal.
Then if it works in Linux, and then we can just fall back to that, right?
Yeah, maybe.
First, we need to check though if it works in Linux or not, if there is any other limitation from Linux side.
Just a question, and I'm not 100% expert on this, but I was at Linux Vault this year, the beginning of the year, and there was talk about capsys admin, and they was saying that is almost like giving you root. So is there like a calls that in capsys admin you're not allowed to do?
That's a good point, but it's not privileged though. You're not going to run it as a root, but you have the capabilities.
Okay, so you
kind of.
Okay.
If you are sysadmin, you can fool the system and become root. I think there is a way.
Yeah.
I heard there is some way.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to mark that item as P1. If it doesn't happen, or even a P2, if it doesn't happen, it's not going to block our beta release. It would be a nice to have.
It's something definitely that vendors or Kubernetes deployers need to understand.
Yeah.
Need to document.
Just real quick. So if what we're saying is you have to run your entire cluster in privilege mode to use Kubernetes.
You have to allow for privilege mode containers to run.
That's the key. It's not necessarily enabling your entire cluster to be privileged. It's allowing privileged containers to run within your cluster. So you can still use pod security policy to limit which pods are actually going to be able to run.
It can still be restricted from doing it. It's not an all or nothing thing.
Exactly.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so next up, deploying external components to GCRIO. This is something that we need from the GKE side of things. If there are containers that GKE depends on, we need to make sure they're in GCRIO. So this is just an item for me. I threw in there.
How do we get accounts for that?
What's that?
How do we get accounts for that to push our containers to them?
I will need to figure that out. I'm not sure.
Is it like a... do they have teams?
I think there's a Google-containers thing, and there's some mechanism to push to it, and I'm not sure what the permissions on that look like. I know
you have to pay for that, though, right?
Yeah. Google's already paying for all that, so it's just a matter of getting stuff in there.
Right.
And for the most part, you shouldn't have to worry about it. I think it's just like a readiness thing.
Right.
Topology, I think this is going to be a big item that we need to tackle. So one of the things that we've ignored in alpha completely is on the CSI spec side, as well as the implementation side, is topology, meaning the ability to provision in a specific zone, region, etc., a particular volume, and then getting that information back through CSI and using that for scheduling decisions. So in order to go to GA, it's definitely critical, but we need to get the ball rolling on that and see how much of that we can implement in beta. My prediction is in beta timeframe, we're probably just going to get the changes into the spec, because this will be a possibly controversial set of changes that are going to take some time, and then once those changes are made in the spec, then we'll have to make the associated changes on the Kubernetes side of things. So we can target the changes for beta, but I don't think they should be a blocker for beta if it comes to that.
So if I understand this one, other than passing that information back to the CO,
yep,
is there anything else that would be needed for this from CSI side?
CSI needs to be able to accept it on the creation side, as well as return it as an attribute or something on the return side. So from the CSI implementation side, that's all that should be required.
I thought we were already doing that. Not we, but I thought CSI already.
No, CSI doesn't have any topology-specific parameters. There's just a bunch of take parameters.
And that's not enough?
That's not enough,
curious.
because the CO actually needs to parse this stuff. It's not just pass through for us.
I think that this is really important for some storage systems, not for others.
Exactly.
So I think that this, like for example, talking about Gloucester, Ceph, and Portworx and all those systems, they understand zoning, but some of them do not.
Yep.
So is it possible that instead of asking the spec to change, that we have a set of parameters that we pass in for topology and saying, look, these are the standard parameters for topology, and we're passing in through the map, through the create?
Yeah, so basically what I'm thinking about here is, one, any topology-specific changes to CSI would be optional, and two, they would never, ever, ever encode specific topologies like zone, region, or anything in the spec. It would be a generic topology mechanism that any system could utilize optionally. So essentially, basically what you're saying.
Right. That makes sense.
But we would require a first-class field, not the existing opaque parameters, because the CO needs to know that this is a special field that means something.
You also mentioned that this is two things. One is the CSI standards. The other one is a scheduler.
Yep.
Right. The second part, there is a project from Portworx that's open source, which it's just working on right now, so it's not perfect. But it's called Stork, and the model of it is that it adds a scheduler extension to Kubernetes. So you can tell it where you want the pod to schedule, because you know what node has your storage. Maybe if it's faster for local or something like that. I don't know if this helps. This could help this topology thing.
Yeah.
Because it already has that extension and that knowledge.
Yeah.
I think that's what Michelle's been working on, isn't it?
Similar. There's some overlap there. We have to differentiate between the two use cases. One is actually three use cases if you think about it. One is the scheduler being aware where a volume is provisioned so that it can schedule workloads correctly, meaning if there's particular volumes available only in a specific zone, it can't schedule a pod somewhere else. So that's the one minimum requirement. Second is the ability for an end user to control where a particular volume is provisioned. Today we allow that through storage classes. The third is what Luis just mentioned, which is giving the scheduler an ability to control where a particular volume is provisioned. Kubernetes does not allow that today, but it is something that we would like to do in the future. So yeah, Luis, we could probably utilize that in the future.
Yeah, it just to answer the last question, it's not about local storage specifically. It's about saying I have 3 nodes where we have replica 3.
I was referring to the topology
volume scheduling.
Gotcha.
So the work that Michelle did overlaps with this, because if you squint, the local storage is essentially just a very specialized case of this, where instead of zone or region being the topological segment,
right,
a single node. So it's just a very special case of this.
Oh, I was under the impression it was general, not just for local.
It is general, yeah. So she designed it to be as generic as possible, but it's not the complete picture. I think she just put in the basic hooks that will allow this to happen.
All right.
So that, I think, is going to be a massive project, but we need to get the ball rolling on that. Next up is block device support. So in
P2. P2.
That needs to be P0, unfortunately. And then block device support itself needs to go to beta at the same time.
But that depends on CSI.
It's like a chicken and egg problem.
Yes. That's what I mean by that. So you can put these at P0 if CSI has the support for block.
So we could make P0 getting CSI block support into CSI, and then like P2 getting block device itself to go to beta, which may or may not happen this quarter.
Yeah.
Next up is node authorizer limit volume attachment access from Kubelet. This is one of the requirements from security, Jordan Liggett and those guys. We need to make sure that So today, when a request comes in from a kubelet to access a particular PVC pod, there's this component that sits in front of the API server called the node authorizer, which says, do you actually have any pods that are referencing this particular object on that node? If not, I'm not going to allow you to access it. So we would need to extend that code to say the same thing for volume attachments. Basically, a kubelet can't blanket access every single volume attachment, only the ones that are scheduled for the node. I'd mark that at P1. We have a lot of P1s. Next up is volume attachment attributes, making that first class. Today we have it as an annotation. Make that a P0. And so snapshots, I'd say it's too early. Snapshots are out of tree as of 1.9, in 1.10 Q1, we plan to make them in-tree alpha. So while they do that, it might be important to start talking about how to introduce it into CSI spec. But as far as CSI is concerned, I don't think that should be a blocker for our beta.
It would be nice to have some consensus in CSI what the snapshot is and how it should behave, so we do the API in Kubernetes correctly.
Yeah, that would take about 6 months.
Yeah, that's going to take a while. I'd say yes, that is important, but not blocking beta for it.
Yeah, sure, definitely not.
You know what? I'm going to take just a few seconds on this, but I feel that the CSI spec may want to. Right now, it is a very, very dedicated to just mounting on mounting, right? And just to enabling the usage of storage in the system. But it in no way has any calls for management of the storage system. So a snapshots has a management call, right? I want to manage the storage system. This is a new thing for CSI. And this is the only concern I have. Like, I would be awesome if it was there for me. But I was thinking that there may be a pushback because right now CSI is a very simple interface. It is, I want to attach, the whole goal is I want to attach this volume to this node, right? Yeah. But this is a management one. If we do snapshots,
so
then
we had this this conflict in Kubernetes when we started talking about snapshots because in Kubernetes we are very much a declarative API with eventual consistency. Whereas a snapshot is something where it kind of is an imperative command, take a snapshot now. Mm-hmm. And we were concerned about how that fits into Kubernetes, but eventually decided it's an important enough operation that should be standardized. On the CSI side of things, I don't think that's quite as much an issue because CSI itself is an imperative API. It is a set of operations against a storage control plane. So the operations include being able to provision a volume, right? The ability for you to create a brand new volume. So I don't think the ability to create a snapshot off a volume is that much more different. So I don't anticipate that much pushback from it, especially considering during development, a lot of people were calling out snapshots and as a feature that we may want to consider in the future, to the point where the reason the create call is not called create and instead it's called create volume is because we wanted to make space for create snapshot.
Okay. All right.
So hopefully it won't be terrible. Let's see.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. And
so let's do a third component CSI spec changes, and we'll move this into there. Oops.
I'm not sure it helps because we also need changes for block devices, for topology, and this.
Yeah, we should just move those things there.
Yeah.
This is something that should come up.
So actually, block device support in CSI already exists. We just need to hook it up.
Okay.
I think there was something else in here where we wanted to make a.
I thought the block device on CSI spec was pretty empty, like sections. It says like block device, but there's like nothing, no attributes, nothing in there.
Yes, but that should be sufficient for block devices. I think block devices don't have file systems or anything special that needs to be defined.
All right, I need to check on that.
The device itself is.
Okay.
We shouldn't be deciding this here, though, right? This is something for like the broader CSI community to decide.
I agree.
Yep.
Because me personally, I would rather keep the like administrative or day 2 operations out of the driver layer. Too much ball, too much, it's.
Sorry, what kind of operations out? I missed that. Could you repeat that?
I would rather keep this day 2 operation stuff out. Yep. It keeps it leaner, and this is a very utilitarian driver. It's not, it's not meant for like.
I think I agree. Snapshots might be a little bit premature, but seeing the development of Kubernetes and the way it went, I think it'll be the next thing that gets asked for. I don't think it would hurt to start the conversation, but I totally agree. This is not critical.
But we could have another, it doesn't have to be under CSI. We could have container storage management interface or something else.
In fact, I think it could be a separate service. Like
Right,
you
yeah.
have identity service, controller service,
Management service.
separate
Yeah,
service, which is
exactly.
kind of stuff.
Exactly right.
I would put it under the Kubernetes storage interface because it is a storage interface, but I don't know if it must go into the same services. Okay, so that is the list of items for entry, external. So let's prioritize these external items. We said allow volume drivers to not implement the controller if necessary. Not implement the controller if necessary. Okay, and CSI drivers should not depend on Kubernetes. Priority of that?
I'd put a P1.
P1?
Yep.
Unit test framework?
P0.
P0,
P1
P1?
or P0, yeah. P0,
I'm going to
yeah.
work on that
Yeah.
immediately.
Yep.
So.
Okay. Add strict validation code in CSI Common.
That should be a P0 too.
I would argue that this is P0 for GA, but is it P0 for beta?
Okay, make it a P1. I'm fine with it.
Okay.
As long as, yeah.
I mean, if those validation cause the driver to fail, or it causes Kubernetes to fail when it's talking to the driver, maybe we should think about that.
Like Kubernetes needs to be designed defensively enough that a bad driver doesn't hurt it.
Oh, no.
This, I think, is asking for like validation, verification, essentially a certification suite, which we definitely need to start. But I think that should be much more a P0 for GA rather than for beta. I think we should get started on it in beta, but not necessarily like block beta if we don't get it.
So are these validation the specs validation?
Yes.
Yes, it's a field parameter lines and the field names are valid. Think of it like a Kubernetes as a validation.go, right? If I get an invalid request.
Yeah, the one you're writing on, the strict validation code in CSI Common, and it's going to be tested by the one right before it. It shouldn't be called unit testing framework. It should probably be called sanity framework.
Actually, the unit testing framework today I have is kind of a mock framework. Okay, maybe it's one and the same. Yeah, that's fine. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So let's be clear. Unit testing framework here is for unit testing drivers.
Yep.
And validation code is also for drivers.
Yep.
And the difference is one is actually like a test suite to make sure that behavior that's specific to a driver is validated.
Yeah, across all servers.
The second is a certification suite saying that it complies with the CSI spec.
I want to really step away from saying there's a certified, but I said, look, it's
complies.
Yeah, like we tested and it seemed okay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Ensure
that's what I call a sanity test.
Complies with CSI spec. Ensure a CSI driver's unique behavior works as intended. Okay. Next up, automated build system for drivers.
I would say P1 or P2. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
What was that?
I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I think that the two unit test framework and code in CSI Common are two different things, and maybe we can take it offline. But I just need to adjust it a little bit. That's all.
Okay.
I don't want to.
Yeah, feel free to tweak these offline, and then we can revisit it next time.
Okay.
So for the build system, we want to call this P0, P1, P2.
I would say P1 or P2. Put it a P2, maybe. Yeah, we have too many P1s. Yeah.
Okay.
Are the drivers or the Kubernetes-CSI layer?
I think both, ideally. We should make
everything actually. Yeah. Then do it a P1.
That driver's in a can of worms.
So for drivers and for containers, and so sorry, you were saying, Brad, this is going to open a can of worms?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that kind of, we have the same issue in the external storage repo, and we're hitting the same issue for this now.
I think maybe just to keep it simple, every one of those drivers has a build system and has a build system for creating a container, and leave it up to them.
The drivers. for the drivers.
So I saw that actually Kubeboard has a better way of doing it. It has a make, build, and make publish. So maybe something we can steal from there.
Yes, probably good enough.
Okay, so we'll call it P2, P1, meaning drivers. We can leave more on the driver writers, and P1 is the sidecar containers because our team is responsible for that.
Hey, so I'm gonna jump off.
Okay, no problem.
But I'll review the doc to see what what.
Sounds good. All right,
I have
thanks.
to drop as well.
Okay.
All right,
So before you guys jump off, if you have a couple more minutes,
go for it.
do you think this is too much work for Q1? Do you think we can drive to beta, or should we hold off beta until Q2?
When is Q1 over?
You're looking at probably code freeze near end of February, and then March would be end of March is when it ships.
Okay, so I'll be upfront. The Red Hat resources are going to. We have some limits. We have to go and redirect some of our focus to, bugs and issues in OpenShift Online and some other stuff. So we will probably drop off the board mid-January for a little while.
Okay, and that includes Jan and RootFS?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, same with me. Actually, I have some hard customer engagements in January. So,
Okay.
but yeah.
So who in this group is going to be able to commit to a full quarter for next quarter? Luis?
I should be able to, but I need to double check.
Okay.
Yeah, again, per project, per section, determine how much time it takes, and then I balance that with whatever I have. Same with Vladimir.
Okay, so let's do this. We're going to have our first meeting again in the beginning of January, whatever that date is, and then let's meet then. You guys can figure out what your availability is, and then we can decide what we want to target for that quarter.
Awesome.
I mean, the other thing I want to point out, until we actually kind of pull these apart, we don't know the level of effort really.
Absolutely. Yep, that's right.
It may look like it's a lot. It may turn out to be not to be that crazy.
Yeah, some of these are going to be tiny. Some of them are going to be massive.
Right.
And don't forget the bugs that are coming.
Yes.
Oh yeah, that's true too.
Good thing is that there's a lot of interest in this, and people have been begging us to try and help with this, so we may be able to get more hands to work on it as well.
I'm sure we will. I may get another resource from ProWorks soon. So.
Nice. All right, I think we can call it today then. Anything else folks want to discuss?
Yeah, you have the last two. Doc write for new drivers.
Right.
That's done.
Oh, okay.
And then
This is like how to use the CSI common framework, kind of.
Oh, that's
But
different.
yeah, make it so that like it'll be a little bit easier for people to follow it rather than copy pasting and then blah blah blah.
You know what? You just may want to add to the wiki. So that,
Yep.
And Travis support, would that be bundled in with automated build system?
Yeah.
Okay, put it in there. Okay.
Okay. So if you guys think up anything else while you're enjoying your holidays, please come back and add it to this list, and then we'll revisit it when we reconvene. First, it'll be like a Tuesday or a Wednesday of January.
Awesome.
Okay.
I'll send out an invite, and thank you.
Are we tracking bugs separate from this?
We can create a list for bugs as well.
Okay. I have a couple I'll add there.
Perfect.
All right.
All right, thanks, guys. You guys had a huge quarter, and enjoy your holidays, and we'll see you in January.
See you guys.
Okay.
Thank you guys. Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.